Cool. So this evening I'm going to talk about GraphQL and in React Native with AWS AppSync. So is that still connected? Yeah. A little bit about me. My name's James. I'm a full stack developer at GraphQL. We're up on Colston Street. I don't necessarily work all the time in mobile. I'm mostly web-based, but I really love working on mobile apps. And any mobile apps that we do get in, I'll lead. We write pretty much only TypeScript. Just catches loads of the little bugs that you might miss otherwise. But then there's still some of those lingering PHP projects that most agencies have, so I generally am the person that has to deal with those as well. Recently we've been getting pretty deep into serverless and that mindset, but we still have a lot of stuff running on Linux, obviously, with it being PHP. I also am one of the co-hosts on Salted Bytes podcast. We try and release one every month, and we're always open for guests if anybody fancies coming on and talking to us about what they do. I also have some Salted Bytes stickers, so if anybody likes a sticker, then come and see me in the break. You can find us on Spotify or at saltedbytes.rocks. So, GraphQL and why I think it's awesome, and why I think you guys should think it's awesome too. Who here has used GraphQL? Oh, great. Should be easier than I thought. In production or just in normal? Yeah, perfect. And who uses React Native? Great. GraphQL in React Native? Yay. So, GraphQL, for those who haven't used it before, is a query language that allows you to describe your data. What that means is really, with a REST endpoint, you make a call and you get all the data back. With GraphQL, you have a single endpoint and you are able to specifically pull the exact data that you need. This means there's no over or under fetching, which means your requests are smaller. You only have one endpoint to manage, which is great. You also don't need to version your endpoint. As long as you're clever with the way you update your schemas, people running an older version of your app can still pull the data they need without it breaking, and the same goes for people running newer versions of the app. So it means it's nice and clean. And then you've got the type system. Being a lover of TypeScript, having the strict typing of GraphQL again saves those silly errors that you're gonna catch. And it being self-documenting is amazing. Just being able to, in the Apollo Dev tools, click on Docs and have it there for you is really great. But it's not a silver bullet. There are definitely some cons. Excuse me. It is much harder to query really complex data. There are services that help you with this, one of them being AppSync, and other things like Prisma, really great. So also, because you have that single endpoint, it's a bit harder to monitor, because obviously you have the log. If you have a REST endpoint, you're able to look at the logs for that single endpoint. There are services that help you monitor this, things like Apollo Engine, but you are then required to upload all your data to Apollo Engine, which obviously isn't the best thing to do. Also, it's still pretty new, so best practice is still being figured out. So things do change, but that's definitely not a reason to not to use it. So AppSync. AppSync is a managed service from AWS. Who here uses AWS regularly? Great. So it's a managed service from AWS. It provides a plethora of tools on top of just the GraphQL service. Things like code gen. So if you use TypeScript, it can read your schema and generate the types for you, which means that your code is that much more robust. It also offers GraphQL transformations, so you essentially have directives that you can put into your schema, and it will know how to convert these directives into different pieces of code. So if you add @searchable, it will create an Elasticsearch index for you for all that data, so then you automatically have Elasticsearch. It's pretty great. Simplifies application development if you're using lots of other AWS tools, and allows you to combine data from lots of different sources. So if you've got a DynamoDB data source and a Redis cache, and it allows you to pull those data sources together and query it. So it really is, it's really great. AWS Amplify. Who's heard of Amplify? Great. So Amplify was released about 2 years ago from AWS, and it's their mobile and web SDK. It's a declarative SDK over all of the services they provide. But before we can really talk about Amplify, we need to talk about what serverless is. Do you guys use serverless in production at the moment? So anything like Firebase, Cognito from AWS, they're all serverless services. And they're basically any service that runs on a cloud provider that's the service is abstracted away from the developer. So yeah, these are some of the serverless things offered by Amazon. There's an awful lot of them, and anybody who uses Amazon will know that the Amazon console is just the worst thing to navigate. Trying to make all your services talk together and work in the same VPC with the same IAM roles and the same security groups ends up being a bit of a nightmare. And that's where Amplify comes in. So Amplify is basically the glue between all these services. You choose what services you want to have, and it will generate a CloudFormation template that allows you to push up, and it will create all the services, all the user group, all the security groups, and it just makes using all these services so much easier. It's not just for JavaScript, they also have iOS and Android SDKs. So it's definitely worth checking out if you do use AWS. But we're here to talk about GraphQL and React Native. Obviously there are lots of other possibilities with regards to GraphQL, but the flexibility that Amplify gives you and all the services that, all the extra services that you can have just mean that Amplify and AppSync is just a win if you want to generate apps quickly. So I'm gonna risk it. We're going to do a little bit of a demonstration. Please bear with me if it all breaks. Okay, so can people see that? Is that a bit small? It's a bit small. How about... that better? Cool. So this is a really basic, contrived React Native project. It's a notes app, and we're just going to demonstrate how easy it is for you to add Amplify to a React Native project and add a GraphQL endpoint. Fingers crossed the internet doesn't stink and it doesn't take forever to do. So as I said, really, really simple. It's written with Expo because Expo is really easy to get up and running for React Native. Let's just click it. So when you're starting a React Native an Amplify project, you need to initialize the project. So just do Amplify init. You'd name the project, give it an environment. So one of the things that can be a little bit difficult with Amplify is the management of environments around a whole team. So if you've got 6 or 7 people working on the same environment, you can end up overwriting each other's CloudFormation templates. They've just released mocking, so now you can all work on the same environment and then mock locally, which makes things much, much easier. But up until about 3 weeks ago, it was a bit difficult. You had to be very vocal within a team. I imagine it'd be quite difficult for distributed teams. So we're just going to call this dev, Visual Studio Code, JavaScript, and React Native. So this is going to generate the initial CloudFormation template. For ease, we set up AWS profiles, which basically gives you your key and your secret. You don't have to number it. So we choose one. So now this is initializing. While it's initializing, I will run through the Apollo connection string. So, for people who have used Apollo before in React Native, yeah, cool. So with AppSync, you have to use their wrapper. It's a slightly older version. It's one of the reasons why. One of the things that's slightly annoying is that AppSync is slightly behind Apollo, so you have to use a different version of React hooks if you want to use hooks with your queries. But they're getting there slowly but surely. So this creates your GraphQL client, and then everything is being passed through. This AWS mobile will be generated when we push our first service, and then we just wrap the whole app in the Apollo provider. Still initializing. So let's look at. So now we have, this is a single. Let's go to the notes list. So this will be our notes list screen, and here we're using React hooks. The standard GraphQL from AWS uses render props, which if you're doing multiple queries and mutations within a single component, gets incredibly messy. So the dawn of hooks has meant that your components are much cleaner. Okay, so that initialization is done now. Let's add our GraphQL endpoint. So amplify, add API. It's going to run through a couple of quick questions. So we want a GraphQL endpoint, and we can choose the standard name. We're going to run with API key because I'm not going to set up authentication now. You can choose to use cognito pools, and then with the directives that I was mentioning earlier, you can add authentication on a field level. So it means you can get really fine-grained with your authentication. So now it's going to give me the option to edit my schema. So it's opening the schema, and let's just delete that and create a type. Put a spell. So this app model directive is basically telling AppSync that we want to create a database table. The default database is DynamoDB, which is their own NoSQL database. So then we're going to have an ID, title, which will be a string, and is required a note, and we'll do a created at, which is AWS. So now we're done. We've finished doing our schema. It's now going to generate our service in the back end. So we do amplify, push. So it's noticed that we've got a new API. If you update it, the operation will be update. So now that's going to create our API. So if we just, while that's doing its thing, so as I was saying, the code gen part of AppSync allows you to create your types if you're using TypeScript. It'll also generate your queries and mutations. So then if you're pulling in all the data, you can just use the generated queries. Yes. We're using JavaScript for this one. And now it's going to go off and generate our queries. This might take slightly longer, so hopefully it'll do its thing before I run out of things to say. So if we take a quick look at mutation, again we're using React hooks for the mutation. As I was saying before, this React Apollo hooks doesn't come from Apollo. It was a third-party service that someone had written while we were waiting for Apollo to release their hooks implementation. They took a really, really long time to do it. It was quite surprising. I thought they would come out much earlier. But that does require Apollo Client version 3, which AppSync doesn't support at the moment. React Apollo Hooks has been deprecated, but it still works fine. They've only deprecated it because the official version has been released. So here, as I was saying, this generated mutations file will come from the deploying of our API, and we're just passing it into our use mutation. Here we're using Formic for our forms. It's a pretty standard library within the React world, and Yup for validation. And on the submitting of our form, we're calling our create note mutation. And then once the mutation is completed, this update function will run, and depending on whether it was a success or a failure, we'll get an alert, and then be navigated back to the screen. You'll see here that this refresh function is being passed down through navigation. That refetch is actually coming from our query. So whenever if the mutation is successful, we'll then refetch the data, meaning that our data will be updated. This is still just doing its thing. Final query is an example of querying for a single piece of data, and here we're passing in the variables through our navigation. So when in our list item, when we click on the list item, we're passing through the ID of the note. This then allows us to query for a single note, which will then display. That, as perfect timing, is just completed. So if we now fire up Expo, again, it's just give it a bit of time. A few minutes to start. Classic. They run the risk. Let's see.
We are so helpful.
Yeah, I know. Will I be defeated? That is the question. And nothing's changed in that file. Awesome. Fallen at the last hurdle. Yeah. Rather than sit here and you guys watch me try and debug this, do you have any questions? Apart from why they're broken.
Does AppSync handle any offline support?
Well, so you would handle that through the client. So AppSync itself does handle it if you use the AppSync SDK.
Right.
So you can within your pages. So you'll see that I've actually got it disabled. So with React Native, you can use Redux Persist as like a data store. So you can then persist your cache data through Redux Persist. Yeah.
That's cool.
Any other questions?
Yeah, what else makes Graphql hard to monitor?
Generally it's because it's a single endpoint, so you're not tracking endpoints, you're tracking resolvers. So you can test the speed at which your resolvers are able to pull the data and return it, but it's just a little bit more convoluted. It's much harder to do it on a local level rather than you're having to push your data to a service to really be able to track it in any decent way.
Does AppSync still use API Gateway in front of it, or is it like a separate?
It's a separate service now, so you can still, so you could still use API Gateway if you're calling Lambda functions, and then you can use AppSync within your Lambda functions, but it's now a standard service, so you, yeah.